actually, there's a countdown on the live stream, but this will start at 5:15. So that's why we're sitting here, so that people at home are ready to join us at 5:15. Thank you for being here. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Virginia Ramey Mollenkott Award. This is a beautiful collaboration between Union Theological Seminary and the LGBT Religious Archives Network. I welcome you all wholeheartedly to Union. My name is Suyeon Park. I am the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean at Union. Union has been in the forefront of LGBTIQ advocacy and justice for decades in the larger public, but more particularly in the churches. Our history spans decades with professors Beverly Harrison and Emily Towns, who have taught here and wrote groundbreaking theoethical work while at Union, as well as our very own Reverend Dr. Patrick Chang, who you'll hear from this evening, who is currently teaching queer theology. And I understand the students are reading Virginia Mollenkott's work this semester. And we claim this legacy and heritage as we celebrate the new grounds that are being broken in theological scholarship this evening. Just in March of 2019, Union created a queer faith virtual and physical exhibition in response to the United Methodist Church's decision that excluded our openly LGBTIQ persons, siblings, from the leadership in the church. It was a prophetic witness to the beauty and the sacredness of our lives. You can search for queer faith on our website, and you will be taken to the world of powerful, faithful stories of our queer siblings at Union Community. This evening's event with LGBT-RAN started when our fabulous MDiv student, Riot Mueller, who's at the back there, who happens to be the communications assistant at LGBT-RAN. And they connected me to Mark Bowman about collaborating on this award ceremony. Of course, I was honored, excited for this opportunity, and immediately turned to our Queer Caucus for leadership. Yay. Special shout out to the Queer Caucus for planning this event, and for Chris, who's back there, for working hard through the logistics. Thank you. And another special shout out to our development department, who is sponsoring the reception after the event tonight. Rita Walters, who is right there, our Vice President for Development, is here with us this evening to celebrate together. I would be remiss if I did not mention that in 2021, our alum, Carol Bratnober, was honored with the LGBT-RAN's Educational Resource Prize for their work called Queering Religious Archives, which was initially an assignment for Professor Sarah Azaransky's class on queering ethics while Kara was a student at Union. This is just a wonderful example of the kind of transformative education that occurs here at Union. So, we have a wonderful evening planned here before us. We are delighted to be honoring Dr. Wallace Best as the Virginia Ramey Mollenkott Awardee this evening. And congratulations and welcome to Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York.
Hello. I also bring you greetings and welcome from the staff and the board of LGBTQ-RAN Religious Archives Network. I'm Marnie Warner, chair of the board of directors. I give a big thanks of gratitude to Union Theological Seminary, Dean Pack, the Queer Caucus, and the seminary staff who've been so gracious in their hospitality and in co-hosting this presentation of the Virginia Ramey Mollenkott Award. LGBTQ-RAN is a very unique adventure dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ-RAN is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. However, we advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate physical archives. Furthermore, we collect and provide a treasure of historical information on our website about LGBTQ+ people and groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And if you haven't really delved into our website, do so sometime when you have time. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in queer religious history. One of the primary ways we encourage scholarship is through an annual award for papers. Since it was initiated in 2005, 13 different scholars have been honored with LGBTQ-RAN's award for over the years, the only award given for outstanding research and writing in queer religious history. We were really thrilled that in the last year, this annual award for papers was named for Virginia Ramey Mollenkott, a Ph.D., who is renowned as the lesbian, trans, feminist, Christian scholar and advocated for over 4 decades until her death in September 2020. In collaboration with Dr. Mollenkott's close family and friends, we've established this Mollenkott Award as a permanent memorial to her legacy, to her courageous witness, especially at the time that she was witnessing, and her profound impact upon the lives of countless LGBTQ+ people, as well as their family and friends. And so it's fitting that tonight we have the opportunity to both give tribute to Virginia, as well as to honor the first scholar to receive the Mollenkott Award. I really want to thank you for coming in person today. You know, we've been so long without doing things like this in person, so thanks for coming. After the program, Brendan Fay, and I don't know where's Brendan right now? Brendan's raising his hand, and Mark Bowman, who's on the podium up there, and I are more than willing to answer any questions you might have about LGBTQ-RAN and how you can support us and our mission. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. My name is Keegan Osinski. I am the librarian for Theology and Ethics at Vanderbilt Divinity School Library in Nashville, Tennessee. And I am just so delighted and honored to have been invited to speak today and to congratulate Dr. Best, to speak about the study of LGBTQ religious history, not only as a queer person or as a religious person, or even as a scholar or a writer, but also as a librarian. So much of my day-to-day work is about access and discovery, making sure people know about the resources available to them, the work that has already been done. If you want to see a librarian or an activist, or an activist maybe, an archivist, get really riled up, just tell them that you found something that was lost in the archives. No. The labor, and it is labor, don't let anyone tell you it's magic, of acquiring, sorting, describing, cataloging, preserving, and promoting is all done with the sole purpose of making items accessible, of making sure people can see and touch and use things. The creation of new knowledge depends on access to the old knowledge. And this is the perennial value of libraries and archives. When I think about my growth as a queer woman, this kind of resource access and use maps directly onto my learned appreciation for our elders and the work that has come before us. Education is such an important part of community activism and the daily resistance of queer living. We need not reinvent the wheel anew in every generation. This propagation of the historical perspective is particularly important for young people, in the company of which I suppose I'm no longer counted. Weird. Gallup most recently reports that just over 7% of US adults identify as LGBTQ+, up from 5% in 2020. Part of this jump is due to the aging into adulthood of Gen Z. Of Gen Z adults, that is people born from 1997 to 2003, 21% identify as LGBTQ+. Yeah, that's exciting, right? That we're able to do that now. There's a whole generation of baby queers growing up who deserve to know the history that is their heritage. One of the most meaningful points of my personal journey as a queer person, for example, was reading David France's History of the AIDS Crisis, How to Survive a Plague. There's also the Netflix documentary by the same name, which presented the history in such an engaging and personal way. It was so illuminating to me as a young person to realize how much we take for granted today, but like in a good way, right? Like the fact that condoms are a no-brainer in this day and age. It was so surprising to me to learn that that wasn't always the case. And the only reason it is now is because of the work and perseverance of our queer forebears. Pun semi-intended. Sorry, it was corny, but I had to do it, I'm sorry. This kind of education is even more important for LGBTQ religious history, particularly because so much of it has been even more intentionally suppressed, especially in non-affirming traditions like my own. And it's even more important for racialized queer religious history, because that must also contend with the ongoing scourge of white supremacy. I must admit that before reading Dr. Best's essay, I had never heard of Clarence H. Cobb's. And this new old knowledge has already edified my life. Like David France's book, Dr. Best's essay reminds us not to take things for granted, but in a different way. For instance, that the church, particularly the Black church, is and has always been inherently homophobic and anti-gay. Or that queer folks have always been excluded from religious spaces, or that non-normative family structures and sexualities have always been at odds with spiritual communities. These things are just not the case historically, and these stories need to be told, because perpetuating these erroneous beliefs is harmful, and the truth can heal. It's so crucial that we continue the work of researching and writing about queer religious history, but also that we preserve this work and disseminate it to the public and future generations. So not only is it important to save and preserve our histories as minoritized individuals and communities, it's important to share these histories, to make them available and accessible to scholars and students and the public at large, so that our stories are not forgotten, or worse, falsified, manipulated, weaponized. This kind of work is impossible without the deep solidarity and collaboration between researchers, scholars, historians, archivists, librarians, educators of all kinds. How lucky we are to have an organization like LGBTQ Religious Archives Network and their projects promoting that goal. To continue to do the work of preserving queer religious history is a radical act of care for ourselves, as oft ignored and neglected keepers of stories, and also for young queer people whose lives are so enriched by having access to the lives who came before them, who fought and lived and loved for them, who tried to make the world a kinder and gentler place for them. Knowing the histories of our forebears inspires us, humbles us, teaches us to appreciate and reflect. So I want everyone to close their eyes. Come on, do it. For real. See your eyes. Picture some of your queer heroes, your queeros, if you would. It could be someone you know personally or not, famous or unknown, someone you've lived life alongside or just heard of. And think about how your life would be different if their stories were lost forever. Think of the gap in culture, in family, in your own testimony. Too many of our queer siblings and friends are lost too early, for we still live in a hateful world with policies upheld by hateful beliefs and rhetoric. I live in Tennessee, I know. It's more important than ever to keep telling these stories, to keep finding these stories, to keep saving these stories. So let's all now, with every head bowed and every eye closed, make a commitment to the study and preservation of queer religious histories, to telling our own stories, to listening to others, to reading and writing and sharing and teaching and reteaching them for the betterment of ourselves, our communities, and the whole world. Thank you.
Good evening. It's an honor to be here tonight and to speak about Dr. Virginia Ramey Mollenkott's legacy in the field of queer theology. It's fitting that the LGBTQ Religious Archive Network's prestigious annual award for outstanding research and scholarship in the field of queer religious history is now named in honor of Dr. Mollenkott. Dr. Mollenkott was not only someone who engaged in groundbreaking and visionary scholarship for 4 decades, but she was also someone who provided courageous witness on behalf of LGBTQ+ persons when so many of us could not do so ourselves. By the way, I use the pronouns she and her in this tribute in accordance with what I believe Dr. Mollenkott's own usage was. Now, if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to go to the LGBTQ Religious Archive Network's website and read Dr. Mollenkott's entry in the Profiles Gallery section. There you will learn that she was sent to a strict religious boarding school in 1943 at the age of 11 because her mother discovered that she was involved in an ongoing lesbian relationship. It was at that boarding school that Dr. Mollenkott attempted suicide after feeling a, quote, overwhelming sense of personal sinfulness. She then attended the fundamentalist Bob Jones University and eventually married a fellow student, Fred Mollenkott, upon the advice of her teachers, who insisted that marriage to a man would, quote, eliminate her homosexual feelings. Of course, that didn't work, and so she separated from her husband in 1967 after earning her doctorate in English literature from NYU. Dr. Mollenkott then began a 44-year love affair, as she described it, with her students at William Patterson University, as well as a groundbreaking scholarly career as a left-leaning evangelical who was deeply involved with the LGBTQ+ community, as well as LGBTQ+ religious organizations. And in 1980, Mollenkott met Deborah Morrison, her partner for 16 years, the executor of her estate, and her, quote, forever friend. And I'm so glad that Deborah is here with us tonight. Before her death in 2020, Mollenkott had delivered hundreds of lectures and talks on feminist and queer theologies, and she authored more than a dozen books, including Omnigender, a trans religious approach, which won a 2002 Lambda Literary Award. Now, some of you know I'm currently teaching an introductory course on queer theology at Union this semester, and it's so good to see students from the course here. Yes, yes, give yourselves a hand. And you know, during the span of 12 weeks, we engaged with literally dozens of amazing queer theological voices from the past 7 decades, from Carter Hayward to Bob Shore Goss to Marcella Altus Reed to Pamela Lightsey to Mark Jordan. And I think it's a testament to the importance of Virginia Ramey Mollenkott's scholarship, that she comes up not only once, not only twice, but 3 times in the course. We first discussed Dr. Mollenkott's work during what I call the gay apologetic theology section of the course. Her 1978 co-authored book, Is the Homosexual My Neighbor? A Positive Christian Response. Is the homosexual my neighbor? Well, is one of the finest examples, I think, of the gay is good phase of queer theology. And Mollenkott argued that we should basically view gays and lesbians as modern-day Samaritans. You know, just as Jesus held up a despised Samaritan as the example par excellence of neighborly love, Mollenkott argued that contemporary Christians should do the same with gays and lesbians. We then discussed Dr. Mollenkott's work in the context of the lesbian relational theology section of the course. And her 1992 book, Sensuous Spirituality, Out from Fundamentalism, do any of you know this other than in my course? Has an amazing appendix, right, in which she cites 40 examples of different kinds of relationships in the Bible. 40, from patriarchal extended families to polygamous marriages to cohabitation without marriage to living in Christian communes. And so I encourage you to cite this appendix the next time someone insists that the Bible only contains one type of relationship, that is one man and one woman for life. Right? No, I mean, scholarship is important. It really gives us the tools to speak the truth. Finally, we discussed Dr. Mollenkott's work during the transgender and non-binary theology section of the course. And her 2002 book, Omnigender, which I had mentioned, was a key moment in the emergence of trans and non-binary theologies, an important theological movement that is still unfolding today. Omnigender looks at the injustices of what Mollenkott calls the bi-gender system through the lenses of scripture, church history, interfaith studies, and science. And the year after Omnigender was published, Mollenkott came out as a masculine woman and a gender transgressor in her book Transgender Journeys, co-written with Vanessa Sheridan. So I find it truly remarkable that Dr. Mollenkott's queer theological scholarship not only spanned 4 decades, but that it also continued to evolve, right? Evolve radically throughout her life, just as the discipline of queer theology evolved radically from the 1970s to the 2000s to today. I'd like to end this tribute with just 2 brief stories about what Dr. Mollenkott has meant to me personally as a queer theologian. First, Is the Homosexual My Neighbor? Was actually one of the first LGBTQ positive theological books that I ever read. And I remember coming across it in the early 90s, at a time when I still felt nervous walking into a gay and lesbian bookstore. Remember those things, bookstores? Called A Different Light or Lambda Rising, right? I remember picking up Is the Homosexual My Neighbor in a bookstore and just being completely floored, awed by its thorough interpretation of the queer clobber text or text of terror. I mean, that's why you need English majors and English scholars, right, to do exegesis. And at that time, I was pretty alienated by the Roman Catholic Church of my youth. I mean, it would be several more years before I would even find my way back to institutional Christianity, thanks to the Episcopal Church and by taking classes at Union. But Is the Homosexual My Neighbor was always in the back of my mind as an example of how Christianity did not always have to be oppressive with respect to queer folk. And so in many ways, I owe my vocation as a priest and as a queer theologian to Dr. Mollenkott. Second, around 6 years ago, I received an unsolicited message from Dr. Mollenkott through the Contact Me page of my personal website. Now, quite often the messages I receive through my website are hateful or creepy diatribes from self-appointed emissaries from God who tell me that I'm going to hell for my lifestyle and or that I'm not doing real theology. But that besides, the message that I received, however, was anything but hateful or creepy. It was incredibly loving, and it's a note that I continue to treasure today. Dr. Mollenkott wrote, "Last night I was feeling low, arthritis pain, etc. And I reread your book, Radical Love, and was remarkably strengthened by it. So I am writing to thank you for writing this well-researched and compassionate book. Love, Virginia Mollenkott." Now, although I've come to know many queer theologians over the years, I've actually never met Dr. Mollenkott. We never crossed in certain, like the AAR or anything. And so I was, and I continue to be blown away that someone like her would take the time to send me such a message. But more importantly, I'll be honest, sometimes I can feel quite low myself, right? Doing queer theology is hard work. It's not always a matter of rainbow sprinkles and unicorns. But I was remarkably strengthened by Dr. Mollenkott's loving note. And it reminded me why I continue to write and to teach in the field of queer theology. And it modeled for me what it means to provide pastoral care as a scholar, as an author, as a teacher, and as an activist. So thank you, Dr. Mollenkott, for your scholarship, wherever you are. Thank you for your faith. And thank you for shaping me and so many others in our quest to love God, to love our neighbor, and to love ourselves. I'm so happy that you continue to live on through the Virginia Ramey Mollenkott Award. Thank you.
Thank you for those fine words. I loved Virginia for decades. When I left our primary relationship in 1996, and we had been together 16 years, I apologized for not being able to keep my commitment. And I said, I will always be your friend. And I didn't have the connection at that point, and yet Virginia was always a friend to nearly every single person that approached her. She was an empath. She attracted a lot of people who needed and wanted to talk. Her scholarship was second to none. We all joked, mind like a steel trap. And the gentleman is correct that she went to Hampton, her mother shipped her to Hampton DeVos Academy because she was a lesbian, and told everyone there before she got there, just so that they give her a really warm welcome. Then she went to Bob Jones, and then she went to Temple. And ultimately, she was so rooted in her scholarship, first just in English literature with the MLA, and then she wrote her doctoral thesis, Milton and the Apocrypha, and it dawned on her, as brilliant as she was, holy camoli, the Bible, which I can completely honor as the beacon for my life, I've not been reading the Bible with the same contextual notice. And she began. Women, Men in the Bible, In Search of Balance, and took apart the Pauline epistles in a way that was non-judgmental. In other words, she would give a speech and she'd say, the head and the body and the Christ and the person, right? Well, which would you rather do without, right? And she was stymied when she came up with all of these nature images in the Bible. And when she was presenting them, she thought that the whole of the church would say, oh, great, thanks for that exegesis, right? No. There was still white patriarchy, heteropatriarchy to fight. So when she was put on the inclusive language lectionary, whose job it was to neutralize, if you will, all of the references, pronouns, if you will, to God, to those of either female or non-specific. She was the only lesbian on that committee, and the entire committee got death threats, and then in the death threats they named, and the lesbian will throw acid in her face, poison the food in her refrigerator as she leaves the next time to speak. The next morning at 8 a.m., we were due live on a Philadelphia stage. My head was on a swivel. Well, the night before, we wept in each other's arms. And I said, oh, I couldn't bear for you to be shot, killed, acid in your face. And being much older and a whole lot more wise, she said to me, there are some things in life worth dying for. And so I got a hold of my little tiny ego, or big ego, and brought it back in to the shape and the size that it might otherwise serve me positively. So it was that context of the scriptures, in so much as she had interpreted the context of Donne and Sherbert and Donne and Sherbert, well, maybe that too, no, Herbert, Donne, Shakespeare, and the like. Her penchant was to teach. She was always a student, and it was very interesting how those two juxtaposed. People would say to her, and I crisscrossed the country with her for 16 and a half years, mostly California and the left coast, which got things, right? But she had an engagement in Texas. And I was trembling. Sure enough, after the speech, one gentleman got up from the one side of the aisle, and he said, I can't believe how you're defending Christianity. That's like, you need to be post-Christian. This is ridiculous. She was answering that question, and another gentleman stands up on the other side and thumps his Bible and says, you are not a Christian. You know nothing about it. Well, when she backed up, and he spouted off a verse, and she said, I think you're talking about this portion of Scripture. And she went 3 verses behind him and did his sentence, and then about 4 more. And when it became evident that she knew her Bible, by gosh, it was a little easier for some roads to open up. And so if I can take a message from Virginia and her massively big impact on my life, and so many hundreds of other people who were suicidal. I had the noose in the attic. I bought the gun. Then I went to the library and saw your book, there's no way I'm checking that out with the card catalog and that title. Put it into my vest and walked out. These were life-saving times. These were contextual readings of the scripture that mattered, and she knew it long before a lot of other people. So she was invited to be on the Inclusive Language Lectionary. She contributed to the New International Version of the Bible, stylistic consultant, and they came out with various lectionary books, which is in the Episcopal Church tradition. And then she moved into gender work. And when she moved into gender work, it was kind of like, is the homosexual? That's such a binary construct. You know, we're really talking about the whole gamut here. And she continued to have to use the machete out at the beginning. And I honor her, and I honor you, Virginia, for your perseverance, for your complete scholarship, your dedication to knowing, your immense curiosity, and your heart just filled with gold and love. Rest in peace, dear.
That was so beautiful. Good evening, everyone. My name's Gillian Frank. I'm a board member and also a jury member for the Virginia Ramey Mollenkott Award. I'm the co-host of Sexing History, and I'm a historian of religion and sexuality. And for all these reasons, it is my absolute pleasure to be here with you all tonight. The Mollenkott Award honors outstanding research and scholarship in LGBTQ religious history. And I'm privileged to be able to present this year's award to my colleague, my friend Wallace D, for his chapter, Everybody Knew He Was That Way, Chicago's Clarence H. Cobb, American Religion and Sexuality During the Post-World War II Period. Now, for those of you who don't know Wallace, Dr. Best is the Hughes Rogers Professor of Religion and African American Studies and the Director of the Program in Gender and Sexuality Studies at Princeton University. He is the author of the award-winning book, Passionately Human, No Less Divine, Religion and Culture in Black Chicago, and also the acclaimed Langston's Salvation, American Religion and the Bard of Harlem. Now, Dr. Best's paper welcomes us into the world of Reverend Clarence H. Cobb's in order to spotlight the shifting meanings of same-sex desire in African American religious communities in the years bookending World War II. The research undergirding Dr. Best's exploration of Black religious communities and the horizons of queer possibility is absolutely breathtaking. And tonight, Professor Best and I are going to have a conversation about his work. In doing so, I hope we can invite you to think with us about the stakes of this compelling past, and also to offer a different angle of vision to understand the religious, racial, and sexual politics of our present. If you would please join me in congratulating this year's winner of the Mollenkott Award, Dr. Wallace Best. Now you have to take this. I'm going to shake your hand. Thank you. You get a check. Thank you. We have to pose for a picture. Oh, okay. Thank you. Look at that. Thank you. Wow, that's so nice. Every time we walk in a room, it should be like this. Yeah. Why don't you sit on this side? I'll sit on this side. You'll change the mic down the thing.
This is very nice. Thank you. All right. Okay, I'm going to put that there very gently.
And your mic's on? My mic's on? Okay.
The mic is on,
All right.
yes.
You're relaxed. We're going to honor you. We're going to talk about your brilliant work.
Thank you.
No pressure.
Thank you so much.
Why don't we begin, if you could, about telling us about the main figure in your history. Tell us about Clarence H. Cobb and who he was.
Well, let me start by saying I was and remain completely fascinated by Clarence Cobb's. I think, I hope that comes across. He was an amazing individual, and I came across Clarence Cobb's through my research on Chicago, right? And it was that section of my book when I was actually researching Black gospel music, right? And I kept hearing about this church, First Church Deliverance Spiritual, not spiritualist, spiritual church. And it played a prominent role and it was critical to the history of gospel music. And I'd never heard of this place. I'd never heard of Clarence Cobb's. And so I had to do some digging. And I didn't have to go very far into the archive to find this incredible person. And the more I looked, the more I found, the more I found, the more I found just how incredibly fascinating, but also how incredibly significant Clarence Cobb's was. And so it was my search for looking at the history of gospel music is where I found Clarence Cobb's, because you have to know something about First Church Deliverance. It is a central part of the history of gospel music. Some of us approach gospel music and think that it's always been. No, you can date gospel music, roughly 1932 in Chicago on the South Side. That's where it was born. And Clarence Cobb's, it fully embraced what was then a new genre of music, and you weren't going to get anywhere in gospel music if you didn't get to First Church of Deliverance, right? And so this came through the interviews that I did with folks, through the archives and the newspapers, the black press, where Cobb's was always in the press for various reasons. I hope we talk about that, some good, some uncomfortable. And so that's how I came across this incredible person. Actually, I was looking for the history, trying to trace the history of gospel music, and I found Clarence H. Cobb's.
So when we encounter someone in the archive that surprises us or fascinates us, sometimes that can be, as it was for you, a moving experience. What were some of the first reactions or questions that you had as you encountered this figure?
I wondered how he could be. This can't be. Because I grew up in the Black Baptist Church in Maryland, where we had a thing called you were either spiritual or you were worldly or worldly minded, right? Clarence Cobb's would have been worldly minded in my church. He smoked a big cigar. He drove a fancy car. He went to nightclubs all the time. People knew him. Some of his friends were mob figures, and he was worldly minded. Oh, by the way, he was always impeccably dressed. I was going to try to go find a 1940s suit for you all to model how Clarence Cobb's would actually look if he walked through those doors. I didn't have time. So I didn't do that. So I wanted to explain how this could be, because the other thing I found out about him was that he was an incredibly effective minister. People loved this guy, absolutely loved him, despite what some would call his worldliness. And so he was an enigma. He was someone I couldn't recognize based on my own theological and my own church upbringing. And of course, I wanted to be like that. I wish I had encountered him much earlier in my life. So that's part of it. I wanted to kind of explain how this could be. He seemed to be a paradox to me, and I tried to just get at that. What is that paradox? How is he making this work?
He was also, as you put it in the title, that way. So before we get to what that way was, maybe you can tell us a little bit about his faith and give us a basic snapshot of the religion that he practiced.
This is incredible, because he grew up Baptist, like a lot of us grew up Baptist, and in Tennessee. He was raised in Memphis, Tennessee, born there, sorry. And then he moved up during the Great Migration, that migration of black folks moving from the South to the North. He ends up in Chicago as a very young man, and he joins, speaking of gospel music, he joins Pilgrim, the birthplace of gospel music. He joins that church first, and it was a natural fit. Pilgrim was really trying to attract Southern migrants, black Southern migrants, to that church. That's one of the reasons it became one of the largest black churches on the south side of Chicago. So that was a natural thing. So he becomes a part of a Baptist church. But in 1929, he leaves Pilgrim to join what was relatively a new denomination, a new spiritual approach. And it was the Metropolitan Spiritual Church of Christ, founded in 1925 in Kansas by Leviticus Boswell, and I remember Leviticus because that was my father's name, and William F. Taylor, two men who were a part of the Metropolitan Community Church, who left that church to found this new denomination. Now, this was an incredible thing because this was such an eclectic congregation, denomination, I should say, that had a mixture of Catholic practices, Eastern Orthodox practices, Pentecostal practices, but also spiritualist practices. They regularly performed spiritual healings, seances, communications with the dead was a very, critical part of this new denomination. So what's interesting about Cobbs is that he leaves the Baptist church and joins a denomination that is very different from his experience, right? And I think I know why he was attracted to this. First of all, he got to know Taylor and Boswell, who I think influenced him not only theologically and spiritually, but also personally. They modeled for him a way to be a queer man in a very, very conventional and sometimes unwelcoming space on the south side of Chicago. There's more to say about that. But he joins this church and becomes fully involved in it and begins his own church within that denomination. And not long after doing that, he becomes very, very prominent within the denomination and becomes known as a mystic, pretty much a mystic. So he has these mystical practices, he's doing these seances, there is Catholic iconography all over his church. So there's this mix. There seemed to be, and I think this was the critical part of it, there seemed to be no limits to what this denomination could do. But the other part about it was that they really cast, the denomination believed in the spiritual world. The material world was a vague, often inaccurate reflection of the real world, which was actually spiritual. And so what that does for someone like Cobbs is gives him a kind of theological basis to live as a queer person, right? Because he's not sort of tied to conventions. This church was fully embracing, because what was truly important was that human beings were reflections of the divine. And so this is beyond conventional creeds, by the way, and that's why Taylor and Boswell left the conventional church too, because they wanted to be beyond creeds in their religious expression. And so this was an incredibly new and exciting approach to spiritual life that I think he fully embraced, and I think it was it was deeply personal for him.
Absolutely. So Cobb's faith, the spiritual church, creates a condition of possibility.
Yes.
To be queer. But one of the things your essay does so brilliantly is you use the concept of the glass closet to explain his sexual expressions, his identity, and the ways in which they're constrained and limited. And I wonder if you could help us understand this phrase, the glass closet.
Yeah, the glass closet. Now, the term has been around for a while, but the concept even longer. The idea of the glass closet, it's a space of limited freedom. right? It's a space of limited freedom for people of, quote, what we would maybe call non-normative sexualities to live as freely as possible. And this glass closet is a space in which people like Cobbs, he was not the only one, living in this space where one could be free in a limited sense about their loves, about their lives, but there was an agreement that one did not make a declaration of one's desire. And so it was this kind of paradoxical space that did offer some amount of liberty, and he fully embraced it. For instance, everyone knew that for many years, Clarence Cobbs was in a relationship with R. Edward Bolden in the church secretary, who he went on elaborate vacations with, y'all, every year for 6 weeks or more with Bolden. And the church would show up at the docks where the boat was about to show up, and they would show up and they would cheer him on. And there he is on the boat, just about to go off for a vacation at the train station, at the boat, or however the transportation they're using. And the church would be there to just cheer them on. Everybody knew what was going on, right? And so that's why I call it the glass closet, because it's a kind of open secret space. What Cobbs never did, because this would have been breaking the agreement, Cobbs never turned to the congregation and turned to Bolden and said, "This is my partner." And I think it pained him not to be able to do that, to make that declaration. But not making that declaration actually allowed him to move somewhat freely within the space of his church and within the community.
Absolutely. But like all glass closets, sometimes the opaqueness of the glass gets broken down. So let's talk a little bit about the sex scandal embroiling Cobbs. Tell us about that and what happened.
Well, there was a sex scandal. That's the first thing you need to know, and not just one. Well, I mean, I opened that chapter with the announcement of Clarence Cobbs' engagement to Jean Starr Jones. If you get a chance to see that photograph, please take a look at it and study it. I've seen it for many years now, but I'm still fascinated by all that was going on in that photograph. It was their engagement photo. And so, you know, I'm getting involved in the story. I'm forgetting what your question is. Let me say the question one more time, because I'm going to go off on the photo if you don't do that again.
Yes, okay. So the people want to know about the sex scandal.
Okay, the sex scandal. Okay, that's right, because I'll get there. Okay, so the photo is mysterious in some ways, because I said everybody knew he was that way. Why is Clarence Cobbs marrying this woman? So one of the explanations about why he gets engaged in 1945, I suggest in the essay, possibly is a sex scandal that had happened a few years before, where Clarence Cobbs was being brought up on morals charges. And this was all over the black press. Clarence Cobbs apparently had been caught in his own home with some young men, possibly young men of the church. And so he was arrested for this, and it became known because one of the young men was injured during a sex act. I don't want to be too graphic, but he had to have reconstructive surgery on his genitalia. And then the rumors start flying. There was even a rumor that the young man died from his injuries. And so this did not go over very well. It possibly was the lowest point in Clarence Cobbs' life, because this was all over the black press, the Chicago Defender, and he was a friend of the editor of that paper, but they published all these stories about that, what do they call it? It was an encounter of a scandalous nature, right? Of a scandalous nature. And what we do know is that someone was hurt. Someone was hurt very badly in that encounter. And of course, I don't think it was the age of the person, but this was a same-sex encounter. This is illegal. And he's a prominent minister, so there are all kinds of power dynamics. And it was just an ugly, ugly, ugly story. So what Clarence Cobbs has to do, he has to recover from this somehow. And the first thing he tries to do, he tries to recover his reputation by saying, and get this, I'm a full man, with the implication that a full man wouldn't be involved with another man. Certainly not in a scandalous way, right? I'm a full man. And so he goes on what he calls these vindication services. And these are tremendously important and popular. These vindication services go on for months and months and months. And then he gets his lawyer to sue the Chicago Defender because this is getting out of control. But that doesn't really stop the rumors. And so finally, after 2 years of this, he asks his lawyer to drop the suit. And he says, whatever damage has been done has been done. I'm not going to recover from the past, and he moves on. So fast forward a few years after that, he's on one of the pages, one of the front pages of the not New York Times, it's certainly not, of the Chicago Defender, posing with Jean Starr Jones, the former wife, by the way, of a mob figure who had just died, and they're getting married. How is this possible? So I suggest that one of the reasons he's doing this is a part of the vindication that he's doing. And it's not inconsequential that this is happening in 1945. There's a historical explanation for why he's doing it. So inasmuch as the scandal played a role in this, I think the historical moment was equally important.
And I want to talk about that because this is the pivot point of your essay, which is a declension narrative in some ways. What you show so smartly is how the Cobb's own responses and other people's responses to this sex scandal tell us something about a shifting relationship between religion, race, and sexuality. And I wonder if you can talk with us about the constricting possibilities in Black churches around same-sex sexual expressions and identities at that moment.
Well, the first thing to say, and someone mentioned it earlier, let's all check our assumptions, right? This is why history is important. Often our assumptions about spaces, about particular churches, are wrong. The other origin story to this article, I have to say, is that I wanted to, in my courses on sex and sexuality at Princeton, it never failed that someone raises the question, Professor Bess, is the Black church, first of all, I have to say, there's actually no such thing. We have to be much more specific than that. But are Black churches homophobic? They all want to know, my students all want to know that. There is an answer to that question. It's complicated. So, but I try, part of this essay is trying to get at that question. Why do we ask that? Why do we assume that? And if we can say that in some broad sense that Black churches are homophobic, how so? How did it become that? So, because I think there's I'm a historian, so I think there has to be a historical answer to something like that. So part of what I tried to show is that, and it came as a revelation to me, looking into this story, looking into Clarence Cobb's life, I did see a shift. There was a reason he could move about so freely. It was not so much his free movement that captivated me, as much as the way people honored him, right? There were people who absolutely honored him. And even during the scandal, people were writing to the newspaper. I've read one just today, just to refresh my memory. One of the members wrote to the Chicago Defender and said, I stand with my pastor. Now, all throughout my research, I kept coming across members or former members of the church who were on his side. You know why? They said he was an incredible, giving, loving, gentle, supportive minister. They loved his ministry. And so even though everybody knew he was that way, what they really valued was his effectiveness as a minister. So one of the things I try to show that in the shift, the culture or the expectations one has for Christian ministry in Chicago, and I think we can branch out beyond Chicago, there were different sets of expectations. No one was expecting, there was no way to sort of dismiss Cobbs as a queer person, because that was not the measure, theological measure used for effectiveness, right? That happens later. So to the extent that even Cobbs himself embraces some homophobic forms later in the 1970s. But prior to the 1940s, there was a different and a much more free and open culture among black churches. So folks, it wasn't always that way. If you had experience in where you consider a homophobic black church, realize that that's a historical development, because what I saw is, it was a gradual shift, and now what we have, and this is what concerns me, now we have people who only understand or only embrace black churches as homophobic. And part of what I'm trying to do with this piece is to put some historical perspective on a very different way of thinking about black church spaces, because there were spaces prior to the 1940s that were incredibly open. There was just no way, there was not a language for homophobia within these spaces. And that's why Clarence Cobbs could move about so freely. And again, I say he's not the only one that did that.
Absolutely. And you point to this mid-century pivot point where things constrict, and you note two things, both his sort of outward presentation and the ways in which he became a little more reserved. But you also talk about the changing religious practices later on, the losing of Catholic iconography and so forth.
1968, this is when he did it. He made a declaration to take down all Catholic iconography in his church and throughout the denomination. As a historian, I really don't like declension narratives. I don't like everything got worse. Sometimes though that is the case. It's more complicated here though, but what you note though, yes. Clarence Cobbs, one of the things that happens, I think that was a real personal turn in his life, is that R. Edward Bolden dies in 1949. And he never, my sense is, Cobbs never got over that. He never really got over that. Even as late as the 50s and 60s, he was still instructing the women of the church, during Mother's Day services to actually put a table in honor of R. Edward Bolden. This is going on. This was a way to declare, I loved this man. I truly loved this man. And he was a huge part of my church, a huge part of our denomination, and a huge part of my life. And so Clarence Cobbs becomes, in a way, unknowable. He becomes, I say he goes from the social agreement of the glass closet to the closet. And I want to say that carefully, but I think that's the case. He becomes much more private. People knew, by the 60s and 70s, we knew fewer details about his life. He's not as open. He never married, and he never developed a relationship with anyone else that was public. We never found out that he developed any relationship beyond that, and dies in 79. But what I find, the reason why I say it's not a complete declension narrative is because he doesn't disappear. In some ways, he becomes even more popular. And he's even more active in the NAACP, in civil rights, in issues of housing. He's ramping up his political connections. He's revered. He becomes godfather to many political figures who look to him for direction. So he becomes outwardly more activist, more present. But personally, he's the one you know very little about. Just imagine him during an arena, one of these services, one of his church services, or some large political arena, whereas decades ago he would have left arm in arm with R. Edwin Bolden. Now he's leaving alone, and that is the Cobbs that you encounter in the 60s and 70s. But you know what's also happening during that time? Chicago was becoming a very different place at that time as well. And so it becomes a place where queer people, same gender loving people, are finding it very, very difficult to navigate that space. And I do think Cobbs would have been aware of this. And so, you know what I think he's doing? I think in a way he's realizing that the world has changed. And just as he was doing in 1945, making a decision about how to navigate his world, he was doing that also in the 60s and 70s, just figuring out how to live.
Absolutely. Living in gay worlds, but also is all about information management,
right,
as one historian calls it, the face you present to certain publics and the face you present in private. I wonder we can maybe end on this note, which is the historian's craft.
Yes.
You lovingly excavated this story. Tell us about how you went about learning so much about his personal life and what source you dream about having or discovering that never manifested.
Well, it's the one I lost. I'll tell you about that phrase, everybody knew he was that way. You won't believe this. I actually had a document of from the WPA files, the government files. The government went around and charging writers to basically document the history of the country, and many cities have these records, the Works Progress Administration files, and so that was an incredible resource for me. One day I was a graduate student working for Stanley Nelson, the documentary filmmaker. He was making another film, and I forget which one it was, and I came across this interview that a WPA worker had conducted, and the WPA worker was interviewing a current member of Clarence Cobb's church, First Church Deliverance. And of course, she loved it. It was a space that welcomed her. She went on and on and on about this. And then he started asking her about Clarence Cobb. She said, well, everybody knew he's that way, but we love him, right? So I found that all the time. Everybody knew everybody knows he's that way, but. So how they measured him was his effectiveness as a minister, right? So that was my favorite. So I sent it to Stanley Nelson to see if he would use it for his documentary. He did not. And I called him and said, I'd like that back. He said, Wallace, I'm sorry, that's on the cutting room floor. We didn't use that. And back in those days, maybe it was just me. I didn't think to photocopy. Well, no, did we do that back in the photocopy things?
We used to photocopy things. We used to pay 25 cents a page at the archive.
Right. So, but I didn't do it. So I lost that. So I still used it because it was a very popular phrase to say that way. Someone's that way. People still use that. So I consider myself an archive mole. Shove me in an archive, lock the door, leave me some water or something, and I will be fine, because most of my work, if not all of it, is empirically based. I have I join those conversations that question the nature of the archive, but I don't question the existence of the archive. There is the archive. I spent a lot of time there, and that's where I found Clarence Cobbs in the archive, right? And so I'm confident that we can all be found one day. We have stories, we have lives, and there will be documentation of our lives. And my hope is that someone can be faithful to the documentation of our lives. You know what I'm feeling right now? I just hope Clarence Cobbs is proud of what I did, because I wanted to be true to him, to be true to his story. He knew he could be found. Even though I think there were certain decades he didn't want to be found, he knew he could be found, and I think he would want to be found. But he would want his story told right. In all the paradoxes, all of that, that's who we are. We're all complicated. We're complicated and beautiful people. And he was a complicated and beautiful person that I found in the archive because he was there.
I think that's a perfect note to remind us of why we're all here, not only to honor your work, but about LGBTQ-RAN and the work of preserving these stories and giving access to future generations to think critically and complexly about the lives that are led religiously and queerly in the past. Thank you all for listening to us today.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Gil. Again, congratulations, Wallace Best. I'm Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, and I've been looking forward tonight. This has been a pure joy to celebrate the presentation of the first Virginia Ramey Mollenkott Award, to honor Dr. Best, to remember Dr. Mollenkott's incredible legacy. Thank you, those who are here, those who are watching via live stream. Just some quick thank yous. Union Theological Seminary has been incredibly gracious. Thank you for Dean Pock for accepting, for Rita Walters, Vice President of Development and Alumni Relations. There was a reception we can all enjoy together here in just a moment, and you could have time to ask questions of any of the speakers who will be hanging around. Chris McFadden has just helped hold all the pieces together to make this event happen. Ian Reese and the communication staff has handled the live streaming. And again, the Queer Caucus, Brendan Neese, who is not able to be here, but Destiny Bates, Victoria Lewis, and Riot Mueller. Thanks for just putting all this work together. So again, thank you. This is a special night, and please stay around, talk to the speakers, and enjoy hospitality together. Wishing you all a good night. Thank you.